Kia ora everyone, welcome to another week of Lunch Money, which is brought to you by Shareises. And so Shareises, our purpose is to create the most financially empowered generation.
For those of you who are new to Lunch Money, we do these every Thursday at lunchtime. This is a place where you as investors can hear from the people leading some of the companies available on the Shareises platform and other investing experts.
And it's not just available live here as we are today, but it's also online as a podcast through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. So, and as well, if you do choose to listen through a podcast, take a moment to leave a rating and comment on the Apple Podcast. We'd really appreciate it. So I'm Sonya, I'm one of the co-founders and 3 EOs at Shareises.
And I'm Leighton, I have the same job title as Sonya. Before we get into today's discussion, we have a small legal disclaimer. Investing involves risk, you aren't guaranteed to make money, and you might lose the money you started with. Any information we provide is general only and current at the time. If you're looking for help with your investment choices, we recommend talking to a licensed financial advice provider. We won't be providing any personalized advice as part of this webinar.
Cool. So as well, a reminder, if you have any questions, so we do a question and answer session at the end, please put it in the ask a question section below because we don't check the chat for questions. So yeah, please do get involved, ask some questions because we've got Mike here and we'll go through them at the end.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to miss those. And finally, please be kind and respectful towards our speakers and your fellow viewers. Otherwise, we need to take steps to remove you from the webinar, and it's definitely not something that we'd like to do.
Cool. And today we're running an audience survey. So if you answer it, and I think we'll pop it in the chat, answer it and provide your details, and you'll go on the draw to win a $50 top up into your Shareises wallet. 5 people will randomly be we'll draw those randomly and lucky 5 people. So the link is in the chat, but you'll also get an email in an email after the session.
Nice. So today we're very, very excited to be joined by Mike Bennetts, the CEO of Z Energy. Michael's here today to chat about the year that has been for Z Energy and how it plans to navigate its way into the future. Welcome, Mike, and thank you so much for joining us.
Kia ora koutou. It's really, really great to be here.
Now, we'll just wait for you to appear, Mike. We can hear you. Oh, there we go. So one of those sort of creepy technology transitions. Welcome to the stage with us. Look, we're so happy to have you here and really appreciate you joining us. We're just wondering if you could start us off by telling us a little bit more about yourself and your career.
Yeah, sure. So I've only really had 2 employers all of my working life. I originally started working for BP here in New Zealand way back when in the mid 80s. I started just after I left kindergarten, so it was a long time back then. And I spent sort of seven years with them in New Zealand, and then I went overseas. I had the chance to work in South Africa twice, China, Singapore, and I did a stint at the corporate centre in London as well. And by virtue of being with an employer for so long, I had 18 jobs over 25 years, and I've been to pretty well every major market in the world. So I'm kind of like a product of the big oil system. I actually fell out of love with BP in 2008. Not that they were doing anything wrong or bad, it's just that there was kind of a mismatch between what was important to me in my career and my personal values and the company, such that I left. And I was in Singapore at the time, and as a family, we had to decide whether to stay away or come back to New Zealand. I and my youngest daughter wanted to stay away, and my wife and eldest daughter wanted to come home. So, yeah, guess what? I did what I was told and came home. I swore I'd never work in energy markets again because I was sort of done with that. And then the really unique opportunity came along to join Z, or be part of New Zealand Super and Infratil when they bought their assets off Shell. And so I joined Z on April Fool's Day 2010. And here I am just over 11 years later, still in the same job. So if anything, I'm very reliable in the sense of I don't change employers that often, but I have benefited certainly in the first half of my career of, as I said, 17 jobs in 25 years. There's a lot of diversity in that I'm very, very thankful for.
Absolutely, and I'm sure that serves you really well now. And you sort of flowed really nicely into the next question. I mean, I don't think Z needs that much introduction. It's obviously literally on every street type brand. But if you could just tell us a little bit about Z Energy, what the company does, and about some of the different business divisions there.
Yeah, sure. So most people know us through our service station activity, but if I sort of talked a little bit, say what we call the value chain, how it all works. So we buy crude from overseas, crude oil, and we process that at a refinery in Whangarei. That meets about 2/3 of what we need to sell. The other 1/3 we bring in from international markets. So we're in international markets, using US dollars to buy our products, bring them into the country. We then store them around the country. So we have to manage hazardous goods in big tanks that you typically see at the ports around New Zealand. We then distribute those products to our customers, which is effectively millions of kilometers traveled on the road, or we sometimes use pipelines to get it to our customers, or we deliver it through facilities you sometimes see at the airport. So in terms of our customers, I say it's boats, planes, trucks, trains, and tractors. So it's every part of the New Zealand economy. We actually participate in every geography within New Zealand. Most people think about us as service stations, as I said earlier, but only about 40% of our revenue comes from the fuel we sell through service stations. About 60% goes to the boats, planes, trucks, trains, and tractors that I spoke about. And what's often not necessarily appreciated is the size of our convenience retailing business, which actually is about $400 million of revenue, or put another way, 1.5 times the size of McDonald's in New Zealand. So as much as even if I think about, people can go, oh, Mike, all you do is run some service stations. Well, actually, we've got a business to consumer segment. We've got a business to business segment. We run a very complex and long supply chain. We have to manage foreign exchange risk. So actually, we're quite a complex business. And I don't mean that in a way that should hide away from the simple stuff that we do, which is to make our customers' lives easier. But there's actually quite a lot of complexity and moving parts in our business. Put it another way, we sell typically, in a world other than COVID, we sell about 4 billion litres of fuel a year. So if we get that right or wrong by 1 cent a litre, that's $40 million. So the pennies really count in a business like ours, as well as paying attention to the operational detail and managing the risks that we have through selling a hazardous product.
Yeah, wow. So you've touched on your different customer groups there, and I guess the different arms to the Z Energy business. Who do you consider to be your competitors when you're across so many things?
Yeah, so in some respects, it depends who we're competing against. So in our convenience retailing business, we compete against quick service restaurants like McDonald's and say Burger Fuel. We compete against supermarkets for top-up grocery. We compete against dairies when it comes to people just kind of wanted to grab their everyday goods, like say bread and milk, that sort of stuff. So that's a very, very large market, about $3.5 billion revenue market. So very, very substantial. Sorry, $21 billion revenue market. So it's very, very substantial, of which we've only got $400 million. So actually plenty of room to grow in that respect. In terms of our fuel business, we compete against the likes of BP and Mobil, so two very, very large global companies, and increasingly a number of smaller companies within New Zealand. There's actually 21 retail brands in New Zealand, or 21 branded service stations in New Zealand. So quite a lot of competition that exists there. If you went into something like, say, the airline business, which is very, very complex, safety is a massive consideration for us. Really, it's only BP, Mobil, and Z that compete in, say, servicing, whether it be Air New Zealand or Emirates Airlines, for example. That's a very sophisticated part of the business, and you really have to know what you're doing. So, for example, you need to have an ability to pay $1 billion out should something terrible happen by way of compensation. So there's not too many companies that can afford to do that.
Wow, you're definitely talking in big numbers.
It's still quite a simple business. Our job is to make sure our customers get products safely and reliably, and just go and fulfill upon their family desires or run their businesses. It's simple in terms of what we actually have to end up doing for our customers.
Yeah, I like how you put it like that. And so, against this competition, what makes Z unique?
Yeah, well, things we like to think about is clearly our brand stands for something within New Zealand. The company started when we bought the assets from Shell back in 2010, and we had to face a pretty big decision around, well, do you keep renting the Shell brand? And it was, pretty well known. Or do you do something a little bit more courageous and move to more of a New Zealand brand that you could reposition and tell a different story about? And we clearly chose to do that. So brand is really important. We segment our customers. Not everyone who comes to Z, whether it's a business or a consumer, is the same. Their needs are all different. So say in our retail business, which is what we call the service station side of things, There's 7 key segments in New Zealand, and Z targets 3 of those. So we try not to be everything for everybody. I think if you're a company trying to please everybody, you end up pleasing none. So we focus on who are our target customers and giving them a set of experiences that they look forward to, clear, good deal on the fuel price, increasingly about digital experiences or ways to connect with us. And in our case, quite a large convenience store business as well. But digital is becoming, very, very important. Our products won't be substituted by digital, but there's a whole lot of the stuff that wraps around that's becoming increasingly important to customers, that it's digitized. So for example, 20% of our employees and what we call kind of our corporate employees, 20% of them are digital people.
Wow. It's a big part of every business now, isn't it? Particularly one of that size. I was just keen to touch on Marsden Point quickly. So Refining New Zealand, which operates New Zealand's only oil refineries, recently decided that its Marsden Point refinery will be converted to an import terminal system. So with Z Energy, both as a customer and a shareholder of Refining New Zealand, why did the company vote in favour of this moving to import only? And sort of interested here in the implications for the New Zealand's fuel supply and stuff as well.
Yes, I'll deal with the important piece first, which is fuel supply and security. So this does not diminish fuel security or supply in any way at all. In actual fact, I think it improves it, but that's quite a detailed explanation around that. So to kind of take my word for it, we've certainly satisfied government that it's not a step backwards. In terms of why the change, increasingly the refinery in New Zealand has just become uncompetitive. The team up there are very, very good at what they do. It's a very reliable refinery in the sense that it spends most of its, almost all of its time producing. That's not the same in other countries. So it's got like a 99% uptime. Some other refineries only run at about 90% uptime. So it's extremely well run, extremely safe in its operations. The issue is it's just not competitive for 2 real reasons. One is just its size. Like, it's beautifully formed, but very small. So there are refineries in the world that are 5 to 10 to 15 times the size of this little thing we have in New Zealand that runs very, very well. So it's disadvantaged by size, and it just faces some cost challenges in New Zealand. So like the cost of energy in New Zealand relative to producing a barrel of refined fuel is higher than it is in some other countries. Labor costs in New Zealand are higher than in other countries. So for a variety of reasons, it's sort of cost competitive, and that just gets exaggerated by the scale. At a time where there are more refineries in the Asian Pacific region than you really need to have. So there's lots of refineries out there trying to find a place to put the molecules that they create, the fuel they create. That means it's just really, really competitive. And COVID just made all of that worse. But it was strategically disadvantaged, and COVID just kind of accelerated what was a tough decision. As I said, there's sort of nearly 500 people up there who do great work, employees and contractors. However, I think it's a good example of just where New Zealand is a long, skinny country at the bottom end of the world, and sometimes that's a great thing to have, and sometimes it puts you at a significant disadvantage. Yeah, we'll be able to give our customers, frankly, better fuel prices by not having to use the refinery anymore, because last year it cost us about $100 million compared to what we used to earn from that refinery. So we made $100 million less, and that's quite a lot in terms of what the customer would pay.
So could you just touch quickly on like what the operational impacts are for the business as well with this change, and then secondly, sustainability side of it? I know there's a lot of people really interested in that.
Yes, in terms of what this actual change means is, instead of bringing in boats into Whangarei loaded up with crude, we're simply going to bring in more boats, smaller size, but with petrol, diesel and jet fuel on board. And it'll just go into a couple of really big tanks in Whangarei, and it will squirt its way down a pipeline to feed the Auckland market. So all you're really doing there is just substituting a manufacturing process with an importing process. There'll be more ships moving around the country from overseas as well, but I think that's one of the reasons why I think supply security improves, because frankly, we'll have more boats on the water at any point in time. So if we do find ourselves with a bit of a disruption, we could always say to somebody who's already on the water, hey, can you speed up to get here? Whereas if we tried to order fuel today, it would take anywhere between 14 to 21 days to turn up, because you've got to go and order it, and it's got to come down from, say, Singapore or Japan or Korea. So actually, I think that's one of the benefits we have. We'll have 3 to 4 times as many ships on the water with fuel we can sell immediately than what we currently have when we come down with crude, which then takes about a month to process from crude oil into the products we eventually sell to our customers. In terms of sustainability, that's kind of like our really big thing, a challenge as a company. I recall saying back in, actually it was November 2010 when we announced our sustainability policy at the time, that it's really important that Z moves from being in the middle of the problem to being at the heart of the solution. We had a couple of goals, two of which sound pretty corny today, but they were quite big things to say back 10 years ago, as we want to reduce New Zealand's reliance upon fossil fuels, and we want to reduce the carbon intensity of the products that we sell. And we said that, nearly 11 years ago now. So yeah, we absolutely recognise that, and we take actions around it. So for example, our operational emissions, so the carbon we throw off in running our business, our emissions are down 17% last year compared to what they were in 2017, and they will be down by about another 40% in the next 3 to 4 years. So you could say, oh, that's really great, and in some respects it is. And what we can't reduce, we offset through permanent native forests. So actually we could go out there and say, actually, we're carbon neutral, which sounds, and it is actually stupid to say, because although we're carbon neutral on our operations, the big issue is actually the products that we sell and the implications that has for all of our customers. So to put that into sort of context, we sell about 12.5 million tonnes of carbon emissions, and our operational emissions are 40,000 tonnes. So you're sort of comparing factors of, it's very, very different. So I'm really proud that we've been able to kind of like take care of our own backyard and get those emissions down. And they'll be down by over from a 2017 baseline, they'll be down by about 65% by 2030. So well ahead of the Paris commitment and the zero carbon bill we have here, or act we have here in New Zealand. But we're still left with this big issue around the fossil fuels that we sell to everybody else. That's our big challenge.
So recently, Z had its annual investor roadshow, which covers, what your plans are up till 2024, I think. Is that that's right? Yeah. Yep. So, can you give us a bit of an overview of what you're focused on there? What's the plan?
Yeah, what's the plan? So it's one of those things. You have these big investor days, and it all gets very, very complicated. And I think the deck itself is about 52 slides. Yeah, so quite a lot to get through, which is why it takes a whole day. But actually, it was slide 6 that summarised the whole thing. And I remember when I talked to the investors, I said, "Look, I'm going to introduce this. I'm going to tell you what the game plan is, and then we'll spend the rest of the day giving it to you in detail and giving you reasons to have confidence in what I said on slide 6." So it's 3 simple parts to the game plan. One is what we call optimize the core business, which means the stuff we do today around fossil fuels, let's get as efficient as we can around that. We want to grow our market share in some areas. We have some plans to further reduce our costs. We want to make changes to the supply chain in the way that your earlier question spoke about. And we want to get our network, as we call it, the service stations, the truck stops we have, we want to get that into shape for how we see the market in 2030. So that's all about optimizing the core, kind of more everyday language, sort of squeeze the lemon hard on your current business. The second step is what we call transition to a low carbon future. So we want to grow that convenience retailing business, although that isn't something people would associate with us being low carbon, but it's a way to diversify our revenues away from being so fossil fuel intensive. We want to scale up to the fullest extent of the government mandate on biofuels. Now, most people in the public don't really know what all that means yet, but the government have a strong commitment around taking, say in our case, diesel. Instead of selling a fossil fuel diesel, can we sell a diesel that's made from something else that is zero carbon? Now, in our case, we actually take tallow, which is a byproduct of the agricultural industry. Comes out the back end of the freezing works, and we process that and we turn that into an incredibly high quality diesel, believe it or not. And that's almost carbon neutral, right, or zero carbon. And there's other things we can do in New Zealand where you can take wood waste and turn that into an aviation fuel, or indeed a form of diesel as well. So we want to do better at that. Hydrogen is a really big opportunity as an alternative to fossil fuels. Probably not now. It's probably more towards the end of the decade. The reason being that you can buy a hydrogen fueled truck today, so that's kind of great. It costs you 4 times as much to buy that truck as a diesel truck, and to fuel it with hydrogen would cost you about 3.5 times as much on hydrogen than it does on diesel. So right now it doesn't make economic sense, but that's no different to where EVs were perhaps 8 to 10 years ago. And then the last one is the whole electricity business, and we already own a part share of an electricity retailer. clearly we could put charging units on our service stations more than we already have. So those three products, hydrogen, biofuels, and electricity, are the way in which we think we can transition our core products away from the fossil fuels to something that's much lower, or preferably zero carbon, and clearly much more socially and environmentally acceptable.
Yeah, I'm interested, you've been in this industry for a long time, and how have you seen kind of this change, the attitudes towards like the technology that's available, like some of the things you're talking here about how we can shift towards that low carbon future, like how I'm interested in like how that conversation has changed since you've been in the industry, but also the possibility or what's possible, how that's been changing.
Yeah, it's a funny old thing. I can recall when I worked for BP, and I remember, I think it was 2001, BP announced what it called Beyond Petroleum. In the end of the 1990s, the chief executive went out and said, the world cannot be sustainable, environmentally sustainable, if we keep on selling fossil fuels. And we set, when I was with BP, set targets around emissions reductions, etc. So that was 2 decades ago. So when you get someone like Greta Thunberg, as I saw her on TV the other day, going, blah, 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 I have to admit I agree with her, because there's been a lot of talk for many decades. So there is something around, I think, time is now of the essence. So I think there's been, in my experience, talking about it for 3 decades, and the problem has not got smaller, it's got bigger, and it's become more acute. Whereas before you could always talk about it as being somewhere out there. Now it's much more in our face. I think we experience climate change effects every day. The good news is I do think that technology is enabling that to change a lot quicker. So take something like solar panels. I've got solar panels on the roof of my house. So solar panels were just cost prohibitive. I put them on 2009, right? So in one perspective, it was it wasn't an economically sensible thing to do. Whereas today, actually, I think it makes economic sense for some people to put panels on their roof. Battery technology enables you to store daylight electrons, so when you come home at night, you can then use the battery to power up your hot water heating or your cooking and all that stuff. So I think technology is making a massive difference in the way that you'd expect. It's what's called the experience or the cost curve, where the costs just go down and down and down the more and more you make of something. And I think that's what's really different now, is that we're starting to see scale in these things in a way that the cost curve just keeps on accelerating, in the same way that, say, computer chips just got cheaper and cheaper every year, such that, we got more power on our mobile phones today than you had inside a corporate computer 20 years ago.
Yeah, my understanding is makes sense in the Waited Upper, and not so much in Wellington still. I don't know where that line's drawn or how relevant it is to where different places are, but it seems like Wellington really needs to up its sun game if for that to be the case. Or we need to really improve the technology, which I think is a better way of doing it, because the other one's probably a hint to global warming, which isn't great either. Just a quick question. So I think breaking down that so 10% was the number of your revenue number, basically from the stores and stuff, the confectionery and that, was that right? 10% of revenue?
Yeah, it's about 10% of the, if we were to count it that way, it's about 10% of our collective revenue.
So it's possible that it might be Z that's the solution to breaking up the duopoly that's been getting a bit of attention in the supermarket space and stuff lately, because that's already a really large number, right? Yeah,
well, so it's a large number for Z. Well, it's large actually to all of us, and that's who can imagine that amount of money, 400 million. Yeah. I think the two supermarkets do something like $18 billion.
Right. Okay, so still a big.
It's big, but it's small compared to. It's like a moon compared to the Earth. Yeah, when you're on the moon, you feel big, but when you compare yourself to the Earth, it's quite small.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if they're calling it duopoly, it has to have that sort of difference, right? You can't get that name unless it's. But that's big magnitude, isn't it? Huge numbers, right? Quickly moving myself back on track here. Sorry, team. Last month, Z Energy announced that it had received an acquisition proposal from an ASX listed company, Ampol, and this, of course, means that Ampol wants to take over Z Energy. Can you explain what the process is when you receive a takeover bid?
Yeah, sure can. So if you're well organised, and we were well organised, you actually have a book called a takeover response manual. Because as you can just think, I'm sure some of the people watching this might even run their own businesses. What the heck do you do when someone rings up and says, "I'd like to buy your company, please"? So we actually just kind of like pulled the manual out because it actually helps guide us through all the steps that we need to go through, because unless you've done one, you obviously don't have the experience. So when the phone call came in, it was all very, very friendly. We already knew what we needed to do in response. So we had a couple of chats with them. We went through a few cycles, very much not in the public domain, and they increased their offer where it got to the level that we thought that's enough for us to do two things. One was to grant them what's called due diligence. So they obviously want to be able to prove out that the offer they've made for the company is worth it, or whether they could afford to pay more. And also the chance to put it in front of our shareholders. So once it becomes public, we can then start consulting with our shareholders. So we're effectively still at that stage. Actually, the data room, as it's called, where we put about 2,500 documents into a room. We answered 200 questions. We've done a whole bunch of management briefings. That part of the process is concluded, and now we're just sort of doing the hardcore commercial negotiations to say, okay, if we were to sell, here's what the price is. Here's all the other issues. Same way you think about when you sell a house or buy a house. So we're just currently going through that phase at this point in time, and we said to the market that by the 11th of October, we'll have something to say, which will be we've sold the company to Ampol, albeit it's a conditional sale, or actually neither of us got to the point that we could shake hands on something, in which case we'll go back to the way it was.
Nice. You covered my next question really nicely of where it's at. Thank you. Sonya, you got anything else to cover there?
Yeah, I think maybe we should jump into the Q&A. We've had lots of questions through, so we'll just start at the top and work our way down. So we'll do a bit of a quick fire. So
Sure.
Some of the stuff we may have covered, but yeah, we'll try and get through as many as possible. So the first one here is from Barry. I've always thought that petrol stations have the most convenient sites for access by vehicle. So what would you do with them in a world where most vehicle power comes from home, work, or a lamppost?
Yeah, I'm spot on, Barry. In actual fact, here's the data. 85% of New Zealanders live within 5 kilometres of one of our service stations.
Wow.
So we have more proximity than any other company in New Zealand. So we often say to ourselves, okay, well, if we were owned by Amazon, how would they make money out of that? If we were owned by someone else, how would they make money out of that? That's how we start to think about what our future in, say, 2030 looks like. In the near term, it's about growing that convenience retailing business. If I give you a sort of a midterm type idea, say 3D printing, where a lot of people may want to do 3D printing. They can't afford the printer at home, or they can't afford to carry the composite, the things you print sort of thing. It's no longer just inks, but where they could actually order something, print it, and collect it from their Z service station, rather than have to go down to Bunnings or the warehouse or wait for it to be delivered, perhaps. So that's again, one of those ideas of how does technology start to enable us to serve our customers in a different way, given the amazing proximity that we have. So that's why I think I'm very excited about our future, about how do you make money out of your location when you're not selling fossil fuels.
Yeah, that segues nicely into our next question from Jay, which is, how do you see the New Zealand energy industry changing in the next 20 years in reference to the structure, the delivery, the consumption, and the source?
Yeah, so take them bit by bit. Electrons, clearly that doesn't play to our strength. We think New Zealand's very much like Norway. 85% of charging will be done at home, 5 to 10% at a destination like a supermarket or your office, and then 5 to 10% in the way that you typically refuel at the moment. So that's going to be a much smaller market for us, but we think we have a role to play in that, both on the road and in the home. Hydrogen, that uses our existing infrastructure. But it's mostly going to be in to airlines and trucking companies, so perhaps less about what you might see at a service station. And then biofuels we see as being very much an intermediate product, in the sense before hydrogen becomes cheap enough and before electrons become usable enough, biofuels is a way to substitute things, because you can drop it into our existing infrastructure and it can go straight into your existing vehicle. And that's much less carbon intensive, but it doesn't require people to spend a lot of money buying an EV or a hydrogen truck or an EV or a hydrogen plane. So we do think biofuels are really important, and the Climate Change Commission has said the same thing. They've actually set a target for 2032. 6.5% of New Zealand's energy, transport fuel needs should be met by indigenous or domestically manufactured biofuels.
So the next one's about Ampol, but I think we've covered that. The next one is, what are your goals for Z Energy in the immediate 5 years and long term?
Yeah, so let's assume Ampol doesn't happen, because then it's because I won't have any control over what necessarily happens that case. But yeah, I've always, yeah, frankly, I only took this job on to help New Zealand transition away from fossil fuels, right? So it's been quite a frustrating decade for me. So my personal goals are to make sure that we rebuild Z as a brand. I think we've lost some of the value we had in that has diminished somewhat over time. Our financial performance hasn't been so great over the last couple of years, but we've got a really good game plan to address that enables our shareholders to have confidence in dividends. And then that whole transition to the low carbon future, I think, is really, really important. And companies like Z, given the size and scale that we are, you can either be a barrier to the change, or you can be a catalyst for the change. And I'd very much like to play in the second part of that. So it's sort of trying to pull off that feat of making sure that we're economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable, and socially sustainable. I'm way too old now to just worry about just making money for myself or for the company. I'm much more holistic in how I think about it. So I'd like to deliver on all three aspects of social, environmental, and economic sustainability for the company.
Yeah, fantastic. So this one is a question from Jay around the Climate Leaders Coalition. Is 2050 a realistic goal for zero emissions? Could this be moved to 2040 or 2030? What is the risk factors involved with quicker action?
Yes, I think the answer is yes, you can move it quicker. It's just what's the cost, or as was said there, what are the risks? So I certainly think by 2050 it's absolutely doable. In actual fact, we should be carbon negative by 2050, I would think, just because of the way in which we can develop technologies around carbon sequestration, which is more than just planting trees, but actually finding another way to sequester carbon. I think perhaps the goals we have for 2040 are probably about realistic. I think the key thing to realize is even if you just took New Zealand, we're already off track, right? We've made a promise to Paris that said by 2030 we'll have achieved this goal, and by 2050 that goal. We're already off track for 2030. So in some respects, I'm less concerned about 2050. You've got to, it's like your investors, right? If you don't invest early in the markets, or you don't start saving, say for your retirement, it takes a lot more at the back end to get there. So I think we've got to be making steps this afternoon to deal with climate change and reduce carbon emissions, because it gets way, way harder. If we wait 5 years, it's a lot more work to be done than if we actually started today. And that's one of the things I find frustrating, is we keep finding reasons not to go ahead with it. And those reasons are really valid, and they come with risks. But in some senses, you're trading off the short-term risk of having to pay more for something, frankly, versus the long-term risk of climate change. And it's a bit, I think climate change to me is a little bit like death. We all know it's going to happen to us one day, but we pretend until we get diagnosed with a terrible illness or we get really, really old, we don't really think about it that much. So I think that's part of it. Human beings are human beings, and then they find it hard to trade off a long-term threatening certainty with a short-term pain to moderate that. And that's the job, I think, of government and business to help with that.
That's an interesting. So the next question is around, like, is it reasonable to trust the private sector to sufficiently reduce emissions without regulatory force? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think businesses have done a particularly good job around earning trust and confidence of people, all over the world. Of course, my company is an exception to the rule on that. But but I think this all over the world. It's over decades. You just see the trust and confidence in companies has been declining, and there's been lots of companies that have given people really good reasons to have reduced confidence. They steal from their shareholders, they treat customers badly, they damage the environment. There are lots of examples of that. I think it needs to be a partnership, frankly, between government and business. I think business can move really quickly. Business understands risk. Business can allocate resources and capital, frankly, quicker than government can. And government can see the bigger picture more. And I think, if anything, the government's job is to provide the guardrails or the boundaries within business can do things. And business are going to get on with their contribution to that, as opposed to keep trying to find ways to go outside of the boundaries.
And we'll make this one our last one, which is around, with the market for EVs becoming more popular, so that's electric vehicles, and new ways of transport becoming a reality in the near future. How do you see commercial companies, changing or evolving to suit that?
I think three ways to respond to that. One is you can put your head in the sand. If say a company like us pretend it's not going to happen, or sort of run down your assets and milk as much cash as you can out of the business over an extended period of time. It's what we call the last company standing strategy. You'll be the last one to sell a litre of fossil fuels, and you'll have been profitable on the way through. You can go to the other end of the continuum and say, okay, I'm going to go and transition the company. I'm going to use the cash from the current core business to fund the transition into the alternatives to fossil fuels. Or indeed, you can be a totally new entrant who's not even in the sector right now and say, actually, I'm going to go in there, a company like, say, ChargeNet, for example, who are New Zealand's largest charging infrastructure provider, just raised some capital last month. And so I think you're going to have those that stick their head in the sand, well, to put it more politely, who run the assets for cash over an extended period of time, those like Z that will transition to something new, and others that will completely come in and just disrupt the business. And that's one of the reasons why we invested in an electricity retailing company, to try to understand that business. And for that sector, we are seen as being a bit of a disruptor. We were in court recently having to defend some actions that we took in that particular sector because we're seen as a disruptor, in the same way that other people are quite rightly trying to disrupt our sector, as they should, because that's how progress is made.
Nice. Kia ora, Mike. Thank you so much. It's been really great having you on today. We really appreciate the time and the insight that you've given. And I know that everyone listening, I'd like to offer a special thanks for that. Also, thanks to everyone who's tuned in today. We're really appreciating the support of the podcast, which is getting some great momentum too.
Yeah, cool. Thanks again, Mike. And for anyone who's keen for some more news and hearing more updates from us, check out our new daily financial news podcast, which is called Recap. It's around 10 minutes long, and it's published at 5 p.m. Monday to Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And it typically covers the top 3 stories going on in the financial news at any one time.
Yes, and next Thursday we will be holding a special instalment of Lunch Money, as next week is World Investor Week. So we're going to be running a panel discussion about due diligence, which is a word that Mike actually touched on earlier today. So if you've ever wondered how exactly you go about researching companies or funds to invest in, this is the Lunch Money that you'll be wanting to tune into. You can register for this through the link in the chat. So we'll see you next Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your week and stay safe. Have a great afternoon.